Welcome everybody for the last panel of the day and something completely different. We are now going to be talking about the effects of climate change on muni markets and on economic conditions more generally. We have three panelists that I'd like to introduce. David Victor is a professor of industrial organization and innovation at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's also co-chair of the Brookings Institution's Initiative on Energy and Climate. Chris Hartron is Chief Commercial Officer at Risk. I'm not sure if you pronounce it Risk or RISQ, a firm that models the financial risks posed by climate change and translates them to actionable insights for municipal debt stakeholders. Yes, I did get that from their website. Todd Metcalf is an economist at Moody's Analytics, where he works on a wide variety of research areas, including the municipal bond market and climate change. So what we're going to do is I've actually asked each of these panelists to start with some opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion. And we're going to go in the following order. First, David, then Chris, and then Todd. So I'm going to give it over to you, David. Yeah, thanks. Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I just want to make sure my screen can be seen. Great. Thank you, Louise. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I just want to take 5 minutes and make some opening remarks about three topics. About the natural science of climate change first, second about the economics, what we know there, and third, what we're beginning to learn through a new study that we're hosting at the Brookings Institution about what the markets know about climate change risks. We're looking at equities, and we're also looking at municipal debt. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on what we think we're learning on the municipal side of things. So just in rapid fire. First, one of the most important things to learn from the climate science right now is that climate warming is accelerating. So this slide here is from a paper that a team of us published in Nature at the end of 2018. That was at the moment when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had just kind of issued dire warnings about how quickly we were going to pass 1.5 degrees of warming. So we went back and reanalyzed all the data using new climate models, and in particular took account of some evidence that the oceans are slowing down in their capacity to absorb heat, and also that ironically, when more countries control air pollution, that actually accelerates warming because in particular sulfate pollution makes clouds brighter and cools the planet a little bit. And so that masking effect was being released. And when you did that, what you see on the red line here is that warming is actually moving up much more rapidly and not at the linear pattern that was in the past. That means that the time which we're going to pass 1.5 degrees is maybe much earlier, maybe 2030, maybe even earlier than that. That's bad news if you live on the planet. I guess we all live in Zoom today, so maybe that doesn't bother us immediately. But it's interesting news if you're an analyst, because it means that a lot of the scenarios about climate impacts that used to be coming out of the climate models in the year 2050 and beyond, those scenarios are becoming more probable earlier. And that may be quite material to the municipal finance business and lots of other businesses. I want to make one point about the economics of climate change. There are lots of different ways that climate change is going to affect humans. It's going to affect nature as well. We often like to convert all that into dollars because we care ultimately about what the economic impacts are going to be. And investors should care about that as well. And a number of different groups are now doing this with quite a lot of sophistication. One group, I'm going to show data here from the Climate Impact Lab at Berkeley and Chicago, and collaborating with Rutgers and a few other institutions. We used this a year or so ago in a big study out of Brookings to look at the relationship between climate impacts and voting behavior. It turns out that people don't always vote rationally. I know that's shocking news. There's an almost perfect anti-correlation between places that are most exposed to climate impacts and the way they vote. So that was our interest a year or so ago. We're now using the same kind of information to look at the economic impacts of climate change and how they might affect different kinds of municipalities. And what this study does is it basically converts all the different impacts, impacts of crops, floods, heat stress, worker productivity, coastal impacts from cyclonic storms, and so on, converts them all into dollars. When you do that, what you see is that along the eastern seaboard, the coastal impacts are pretty significant. But overall in the country, the single most important thing to take away from this area of the economic science meets climate science is that heat stress, its impact on productivity, and its impact on death. Heat stress is what really drives the economic impacts. That's something that we in the municipal finance world should be paying attention to, because it's going to affect tax bases and a variety of other things. The third and last thing I want to talk a little bit about is, what do we see when we go off and look at issuances of municipal bonds, about what are people saying with regard to climate change impacts? Let me just say, this is, I'm new to this area, and we're doing the same thing in equities. It turns out it's a lot easier to do it in equities. We can, over 5 days, look at all 3,000 of the largest traded equities for an entire decade at all their 10Ks and get it all done in 5 days with machine learning and a variety of other tools. It takes us a week to do a couple of hundred bond issuances, and Chris Hartron runs a terrific blog, and I sure can share stories about how difficult it is to kind of figure out exactly what the municipal finance industry knows about climate change, because we're working one bond at a time. And so any of you out there in the cyber sphere who have big data sets and an interest in talking publicly about what we actually see in these instruments, we are ready to collaborate, because we are really struggling with this from a data perspective. This shows with states as the unit of analysis from a sample, and I can talk more in detail about the sampling, which bond issuances, what fraction of bond issuances, up to 86%, fraction of state level bond issuances, or aggregate at the state level, say anything about climate change. There's a clear coastal effect. There's actually, we think, going to be a pretty significant political effect. It's not just the coasts that are more exposed, it's actually, they're also more blue, so they're saying more about climate change even when they're not as exposed as other places. And the last slide I want to show is an effort to look at this data in a very granular way. And what this shows is, on the horizontal axis is the predicted income loss near the end of the century from that same study that I mentioned earlier, the Climate Impacts Lab study. So this is county level resolution. The science is really advanced on high spatial resolution analysis of economic impacts. And then the vertical axis is reading bond by bond, which is always fun, the percentage of bonds that mention climate change at all. And what you see is a cloud of data. Essentially no relationship between, there's a little bit of relationship depending on how you look at the data, essentially no relationship between projected income loss and mentions of climate change. Now, of course, this is projected income loss, median loss in the later part of the century. But if you take seriously what I said earlier about how quickly the climate science is changing and accelerating, and in particular recognizing tail risks, then these are the kinds of things you'd at least think people would begin to be talking about. And if you take just Johnson, Texas, which is one of the places that's mentioned right there, and you say, well, what does Johnson, Texas say about climate change risk? Here's what they say, the sum total of what they say in their most recent general obligation bond, which is, it's a phrase about economic impacts relating to domestic and international climate change. So I guess that's limited just to the planet. And it's in the context of hostilities, cybersecurity issues, and everything else, the kind of standard catch-all information. So I think it's really interesting. There's a company connected with Todd's shop, Chris Hartron's company, does more analysis in this area. There's a lot of analytical tools that are emerging that allow us to do a whole lot better in talking about climate change impacts than we are right now. But right now, the market knows, as far as I can tell, approximately nothing that is useful with regard to climate change exposure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's move right to Chris.
Great, going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll assume that everyone can hear me okay. And go ahead and present, and then I'll minimize that. Great, so David provided an excellent lead-in. I'm not going to go ahead and belabor the point on disclosure, although I could go on ad nauseum about the quality of climate risk disclosure. Since risk is probably a new name to most people, just the quick background as to what we do, why we do it. So actually spun out of Northeastern University, this a renowned sustainability and data science lab there. Does some excellent work. We're on a 4-year journey, substantially funded by the NSF, that has landed us as our first application, our first market in the municipal bond sector and the fixed income space broadly. And with some partners that I think some people in this conference will recognise, Tom, Lisa, Matt, and the team at MMA. We've been working with them for a good couple of years. And then ICE Data Services are a market partner of ours as well. We've gone to the trouble of doing full climate risk analysis for the entirety of the obligor issuer and CUSIP universe that represents the muni bond space. There are a couple of canonical constructs that we talk about, or that we can simplify down to at least. Obviously, there are many economic factors and exposures that we talk about, but the primary ones, property value at risk and GDP impairment risk, I guess the canonical variables that we can look at in the context of different stresses that are out there. And so if you take a look at any given issuer, any given obligor, so for example, Harris County, Texas, victim of Hurricane Harvey and other events, other contemporary events, you can get into a breakout of property value at risk by time. And you can place Harris County on a percentile basis across the national cohort of all counties in terms of property value at risk to a given date. And you can do exactly the same thing from the GDP impairment risk basis, and also see distributions within space as to whether GDP is impacted by different perils more so than property value. That obviously has interesting implications for how it flows through to different types of bond issuers and different types of revenue streams that underpin those bonds. The interesting part of this comes, and this is a couple of key points that I'll make going into the discussion. Interesting part of this comes when you start breaking down that type of risk. So the property value at risk and the percentiles that you can place each and every cohort and each and every geography in. So if we look at inland flooding alone on a percentile basis, we can actually break down individual cohorts. So looking at, for example, all the counties across the US in the context of the percentiles they fall in on an inland flood basis, inland flood risk basis to residential property, we can drop them into buckets. Those buckets of percentiles allow us to then do some really interesting things, such as take those percentiles and find correlations or correlations between what percentile a given county falls into in terms of inland flood risk and what have been the realized changes in real estate value even over the last, 6 or 7 years. And you can see the worst 10 to 15% of counties in terms of inland flood risk have seen noticeable differences in terms of the real estate value change that's occurred over time. You can take the same data and you can also look at what's happened to net migration rates. Again, the worst 10 to 15% of counties on an inland flood basis have seen by far the largest changes in actual negative net migrations of population as a result of the inland flooding risk and the realization of that inland flooding risk. So there's a couple of components in here that I'll point out. First one is we all like to point to the Miamis of the world for hurricane risk. We all like to look at California because wildfire events are a front page New York Times event, right? But as it turns out, inland flood risk is probably the highest and most systemic contemporary risk to the underlying health of many issuers across the country, and actually the lion's share of the issuer base that's out there. And the second key takeaway is we talk about these 2060, 2080, 2100 year reports and outlooks. Climate risk is already having meaningful impacts upon population and meaningful impacts upon real estate value, which are two of the underlying fundamental health parameters that one has to look at when one's considering the health of an underlying issuer. Okay, so we'll set that aside for a moment. Then we'll look at hurricanes, because why not? The other takeaway I'll give you is it's easy to talk about states and sort of the high-level issuers and the headliners, right? It's easy to talk about counties as well, which I've already done in terms of inland flood. But there are meaningful risks to different types of issues out there. As everyone on this in this conference knows, we're not just talking about municipalities when we talk about municipal bonds. Hospitals are issuers of debt, and hospitals suffer significant revenue impairment from these events as well. So it's important to take all of this in context and look at the types of impairment events and the types of first payment default data that's out there. And this is taken from our friends at MMA, borrowed with pride from around the start of this year. This is looking at a rank order of the different types of issuers and the first-time payment defaults that are experienced. You can see that the GO issuers, the issuers that most talk about, are not at the top of this list. It's CCR, it's retirement communities, so CCRCs, it's housing, it's charter schools, it's hospitals. These revenue bond issuers are substantially at risk from climate events because they're already substantially more impaired on a percentage basis. So if we look, we've already talked about hospitals a little bit, but we can also talk about land secured. A couple more examples on hospitals. Hurricane Harvey took the Care Regional Medical Center into bankruptcy down in Corpus Christi. A hospital with exactly the same percentile risk in terms of overall climate risk. It sits in the 97th percentile out of all 7,500 hospitals that we've analysed that bring debt into the market. Sits in exactly the same approximate space with exactly the same risk. And yet, if you go and look at disclosures, if you go and look at risk mitigation, if you go and look at any of these things associated with these types of issues, you're not going to find a whole lot, but I guarantee the risk is there, as Care Regional will tell you. And then the last component in here is the level of geospatial specificity that you've got to bring when understanding all of these issues. It's not, if you understand Harris County overall, that is certainly interesting and valuable if you're analyzing Harris County specifically. But when you get into land deals, dirt deals, so all the MUDs across Harris County, you can see the 100-year inland flood risk, the 500-year inland flood risk, the hurricane flood risk. There is a wide distribution of risks across the MUDs that fall within the boundaries of Harris County. And when you go and look at the yields, the coupons, all of the underlying financial risk metrics and where you would expect risk to be taken into account, you're not going to are more likely to come from the impaired classes from the MMA data. So there's a lot to chew on in there, but it's basically the risks are contemporary and now. It's not just hurricane and it's not just wildfire, it's also inland flooding, but it's also some of the smaller issuers that we have to worry about in that context. Just so anyone's wondering, 2020's not setting up terribly well for those in the climate risk game. So expect a heightened hurricane season for this year, expect a heightened wildfire season well above historical averages for this year, and your inland flooding risk is going to be higher this year as well. And I'm sure I'm belaboring a point that's already been hammered over the last day and a half, where the entire municipal market is already under a little bit of stress, it's fair to say. And financially, logistically, and temperamental is probably in as bad a position as it can be to handle some of the stresses that are going to come in the second half of this year from a climate perspective. With that, I will pass it over to the panel.
Yes, Todd.
How do you follow that?
Something more optimistic.
Well, I'm not sure how optimistic I will be, but so far we've been focusing, especially with David, on kind of the disclosures, with Chris on a lot of the specific kind of low-level impact. And kind of the holy grail is, what is the physical risk? What's the cost of that? What's the likelihood of it occurring? How much does it cost to mitigate? And then what's the difference? And that's an important part of the equation. But we looked at the other side, and that was what's the creditworthiness of places going to be able to pay for damages? And how is that going to then impact their ability to adapt? Not surprisingly, population changes can impact creditworthiness of bond issuers. I'm going to do a quick disclosure. So as was mentioned, I'm Moody's Analytics. I do not rate bonds. We do the economic forecasting for Moody's, and we do a lot of our credit risk models. So I work on our credit risk municipal bond model. And so MIS actually, Moody's Investor Services puts out an annual default study, and population change has been one of the big things that well, it shows up in some of our defaults. As Chris mentioned, hospitals are actually one of the ones where that has occurred a few times, where population changes have really impacted the default. But it's also shown up in local governments, the two big examples being Detroit and Puerto Rico. Now, according to Moody's at least, Chris might disagree with this, there has not been a default directly due to natural disasters. There have been downgrades. So the big examples there would be New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, which was a large population hit, and that was a very large part of that. But then also Paradise, which is currently rated as a junk bond following the Camp Fire, but as of now, it has not defaulted. So the thing where I think this is important is, and I'm going to share my screen real quick, is looking at what the overall headwinds are going to be from a population standpoint. And so what we see is this is the 30-year change in creditworthiness. So we took the 30 years preceding, so 1990 to 2020, and predicted what that population change would say that our metro areas would be rated today. And then we took the 30-year baseline population and we projected that out to 2050 and looked at where we would be. And I think this is one of those, unfortunately, this is not optimistic. It shows that in general, we're going to be less creditworthy just because of population. This is before COVID stress. This is before pensions. This is before anything else. And so it's not climate, but I think it's important because it helps to set up where we're going to be able to pay for it. Now, we use the EPA's ICLS model under the Hajam climate model, which basically redistributes population based on summer and winter temperature and precipitation. And so the idea is that people are going to move to nicer climates. And using that model, what we found was that it's obviously going to change the population distribution. And so what we actually see on that, now it's not necessarily all good news. We see the South Central increasing slightly and the Midwest increasing slightly under that model. But of course, it's slightly better than the baseline, which still shows still shows a decline. Now, so that's one of the important things to consider, but then we also see the stress in the West and on the East Coast. And so we know that basically there's going to be extra impairment in those areas. And then just so
is the first chart without thinking about environmental changes and the second one with? I just want to clarify.
Correct. So the first one, so this is our baseline. This is just our baseline 30-year forecast. Okay. And then the second one is just under the 4.5. And I use this as kind of the representative. Under 8.5, it's qualitatively similar. There's some places that change just because of just how the pattern changes overall. And then taking it out to 2100, they're qualitatively similar. Each one will kind of show slight differences, but they're more or less the same.
Okay, sorry.
Not a problem. And so the big thing though for this is there was a model I want to say came out in February where they showed climate or population changes under sea level rise. And so I think they would disagree with us on Florida. And there's going to be differences, but I think the big points here is that we're already going to be weak, and a lot of areas that are going to have problems paying for adaptation, these problems are going to be exacerbated. So unfortunately, as I said, I was not as optimistic as you may have hoped.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, 17 minutes for questions. So if viewers want to write in, and just a reminder for the last time that you can submit questions at emailing events@brookings.edu or by joining the conversation on Twitter using hashtag MuniFinance. But let me talk a little bit about what I heard. So I actually heard sort of three different focuses in terms of the bad impacts from climate change. David, you talked about heat stress and the effects on health and productivity. Chris, you talked about inland flooding, and Todd, you talked about population. When we think about those, are they, do three of you disagree about the most important things, or is it that you're looking at it from different perspectives? Anybody? Yeah,
I
David.
think it depends on what your goal is. And the list goes on from there. You know,
Yeah.
You want to have optimism, don't have a panel on climate change. But so there are, for example, big impacts on crops, although the impacts are mixed, because in some places growing seasons get longer. Some plants actually grow better with a little more CO2 in the atmosphere. Others on the margins are harmed. And so when you put all that together, if you look at the overall economic impacts of the country, it's no question that the overall economic impacts, when you start killing large numbers of people, significant numbers of people, and hurting productivity, for which there's now a lot of empirical evidence that the economic drain of that is substantial. In some places, the coastal impacts are dominant. But I just want to underscore something that Chris said, which I think is very important for understanding the intuition from the climate science that matters for the municipal finance world. The high-profile activities where a hurricane or a tornado wipes something out and then people come in and rebuild, the economic impact of that sometimes actually neutral or positive. We don't like to talk about it that way, but in terms of local community. But it's these persistent events. It's inland flooding that drives people away. I think the heat stress story is going to turn out to be very important. You know, in some places in the world where heat stress is high, Qatar, and they air condition the outdoors. Well, not everybody can do that. And so instead, what we're going to do in this country is people are going to move. And so you're going to have a few areas where these climate impacts, wildfires, an example of that, where the systemic impacts are going to be migration, erosion of tax bases, and so on. I think that's the thing to really watch.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. We can
the David.
Can you say it again? We lost you for a minute.
Yeah. So my take on things is not different than David's or Todd's. I think it's in some ways it's additive. So we totally agree that droughts and heat stress are going to be significant problems. We absolutely agree. In fact, we've got data to suggest that population is a meaningful metric to watch migrate over time. Excuse the pun. We just think there are probably some nearer term risks, some contemporary risks that need to be looked at right now. And to David's point, we think that a lot of them are underpinned by bad fundamentals in terms of P&C insurance, where in the past there's been substantial insurance coverage, and then where there's not insurance coverage, there's been FEMA coverage. P&C insurance is backing out of the high-risk areas, and I wouldn't look at the balance sheet of FEMA as being particularly robust right now and no more robust in the future. So I would take an all of the above, not to be Debbie Downer or Donald Downer, depending on what your flavor of Downer is. I think I'm an all flavors Downer. So all of the above for my answer.
So you brought me to one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is about this, the FEMA put. So you're looking at current FEMA conditions, but we're talking about, look at 50 years and ahead, and also just more generally, small things might be FEMA, but if you have a huge area that is really struggling, you can imagine some other kind of too big to fail thing coming in. So when you think about whether or not these risks are priced into bonds right now, do you think, first of all, if they are, and if they're not, how much of it is because people believe that somehow the federal government will protect against the biggest tail risks? Or, David, you said that you didn't see them mentioned in the bond prospectus, but do we think that they're priced in directly or indirectly through what's already happened?
I think it's just starting to really be thought of. The Moody's Investor Services, the ratings agency, has been, so David mentioned one of the companies that they just bought was 427. And that was to be able to understand the risk better. There was a Urban Institute study, I guess, out last year where basically they mentioned that once the credit rating agencies actually decide that they're going to be pricing it in, that's when it'll truly be priced in, because the market will have to do it. CRE is starting to price it in now, because that 30 years horizon, now I guess Chris would argue that it's already being seen, but that 30-year horizon is kind of where I think most people are seeing the most risk being. And that's starting to get to our financial horizon where, okay, we need to price that in. But a lot of the risk are 100 years out, and that's really difficult to price in. But though insurance companies obviously still need to be concerned about that. But it's complex, and it goes back to kind of that first question. There are so many parts and so many moving parts, and some areas are going to benefit and some areas won't, and where you'll actually see that, it's going to be difficult to tell long term. And so I think it's going to be a rolling, we're just going to get better at it.
Yeah, and if I could just comment on that, just two things very briefly. I agree, it's complex, life's hard, and so on, but we now have skills to allow us to analyze this with a coefficient that's not zero. And that's what these companies are about, and the science is about, and so on. To me, what's really striking about the climate impacts work is how the uncertainties have gone up. So we tend in the climate science world to be talking about how much we know, and we want to make sure everyone knows we know what we're talking about, and so on. And sure, that's true to some degree, but a lot of these impacts are tail risks, and they're interactive tail risks. And so the science has actually moved in the direction of understanding the full breadth of outcomes. And you see this in interesting things like the range of possible sea level rises reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has doubled over the last two assessments. California, when they updated their sea level rise guidance from 2015 to 2018, which is the last big update, they literally doubled for the year 2050, not, in the year 2300 and so on, but the year 2050, they've doubled. They didn't assign probabilities and they did some other wacky things, but hey, it's California. But they doubled the high-end estimate, almost double the high-end estimate. And so this is really, I think this is what we're now seeing. And the point about whether the markets are pricing this differently, we're just finishing a big review paper and an analytical paper. The slide that I showed, a couple slides I showed today are the results that are literally a week old from that paper that we're working on. But as part of it, we did a big lit review. There is a couple of peer-reviewed papers that suggest using extremely large samples that the markets, exactly as Todd said, are beginning to price it in a very, very minor way, in particular around sea level rise and some things about real estate value. But the signal is really hard to see, and you need a gigantic sample for it.
And Todd, you mentioned something interesting, which if you can sort of write a model where you say, if you do nothing, here's what the costs are. That's one way of evaluating the cost. But you also mentioned there's maybe it's the mitigation costs. And so, is anybody trying to sort of to do that as opposed to when you think about what it's going to cost state and local governments?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think part of that is because until you can tell it's hard to tell whether you should mitigate or how much you should spend to mitigate until you know how much it's going to cost you. Because if the mitigation costs more than the damage, you take the damage. Mm-hmm. So I think unfortunately, I think it's still being priced. I mean, there's sea level or a seawall is being talked about being built in Miami by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so we're starting to price mitigation, but I don't think there's anything really comprehensive on that, at least not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, nothing comprehensive. We've seen a couple of the very leading high-profile areas of the country. So Miami Beach did a really good study looking at the cost of mitigation and the benefit of mitigation, but it's on very case-by-case basis and certainly nowhere near across the broad spectrum of 55,000 some odd issuers, right? So it's the early adopters are starting to think about this, and only the ones that are sort of the front page. Everyone talks about Miami, so Miami's doing it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to really change the way we do the analysis, because we often analyze things at risk. But the moment you start hardening the assets, then you really need to understand the damage function, like power pole by power pole and bridge by bridge. And that's the frontier of the engineering science right now.
So Chris, you sort of looked at this all sort of from the perspective of the municipal bond market, and you too, Todd, obviously, which do we think, so I sort of think of it on two ends. One, that's the first place we're going to start seeing that it matters and maybe be a public policy signal that people should be, policymakers should be doing something about it. But then I also wonder whether or not that lens is the public policy lens. As you mentioned, like, you don't worry about general obligation bonds, we worry about hospitals because they might go bankrupt. But when we think about, the deaths that David mentioned, is that going to be reflected? So how do you think about that? I know you said you're funded by the NSF, so you have a public mission. How do you think about that, Chris?
Well, we're no longer funded by the NSF, so our public mission to become an entrepreneurial mission. You're quite clear. But no, to your point, there is an interesting disconnect between public policy that is municipalities, that is the state, that is the federal level, versus the public policy that impacts the revenue lines of the underlying service providers that nonetheless put debt out into the municipal market, right? So, and it's actually where we see the greatest gap in knowledge as well as the greatest gap in responsibility. You rarely see climate risk disclosed in revenue bonds, and particularly the non-city, non-state, non-federal level bonds, because the knowledge isn't there, the expertise isn't there, the ability to do anything about it isn't there, and therefore, well, what's to talk about if you don't know and you can't tell and there's nothing you can do, then okay, let's just be silent. So it is going to fall back, I think, from almost like a social perspective onto public policy to think about the underlying services that nonetheless put debt out into market through different instruments, even though that's through the municipal bond market. It's an interesting dichotomy one could point to that has to be solved for.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. This is not the only area where there are very big public policy issues, and the exposure on real estate is pretty substantial. And I think, there's a lot of implications of what we're all trying to get our hands around, which has to do with better disclosure and information in the market so the markets can respond. And then we ideally want to be able to see what that response is. We also need to work much harder on the FEMA and other puts. The flood insurance, the way even flood insurance is computed. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on there, and this backward focused analysis of perils when climate is a different future is really inappropriate. So there's all these areas where we could do some more, we have to do some more work to get the markets to function better, and where the policy is creating these really big market failures.
So we got a question from the audience. So do panelists anticipate that COVID-19's public health and economic impacts will direct attention and funding away from climate adaptation at the local level? And so how do we think about that? Like, were we starting to focus on it and now we just got completely, off track because now we have another crisis that's near term to worry about, or are they related at all? Or how do you think about that?
So it depends on your theory of change. So Elke Weber at Princeton, among others, has advances a kind of fixed pool of worry theory from cognitive psychology, which is people have a pool of things they worry about, and right now COVID is filling up the pool, and so there's less time for climate change. And there's substantial evidence, in particular around the stimulus spending programs, that that's true. If you compare the stimulus spending programs and the amount of money, for example, that were devoted to clean energy in the last 2009, it was upwards of 15%, depending on how you count. This time around, much, much less. And of course, you got all these municipalities that are nobody's feeling rich right now, so they're not scrambling to go build a seawall, whether or not it's a good idea. So I think overall the impact, especially in this country, the impact has been negative. The situation in Europe's a little bit different because of the way politics are organized around green issues, but we don't live in Europe.
Well, and I think that's also the quick important point is capability, I think, is to be able to even start thinking about this is being diminished at the state and local level. And unless there's the extra stimulus to bail them out, it's going to stay impaired for a while. So.
And what's happened at the federal level in terms of capability to think about these questions?
I think it's been willfully denied.
Gosh. Yeah, well, there was actually an interesting report that came out from the GAO today, talking about the changes in climate change assumptions that occurred with the change in administration. And ultimately, they began to use different boundary conditions, different assumptions, and different metrics to optimize to, and basically ended up with a climate change scenario that was at best 7 times lower than what the previous administration put into place. So flow that through the likely funding mechanisms and for the likely purviews of federal through state down to city. I think that's pretty clear. And supposedly the GAO is still a nonpartisan organization. And tell me something that's nonpartisan these days, and I'll say you're a bridge.
Yeah, you asked for optimism. If I can offer any optimism, it's that there are 2 federal governments, right? There's the federal government that Jared, I gather, runs. And that's government is messing around and doing all kinds of crazy things with regard to science and facts, and 2 + 2 is 97 and all kinds of stuff like that. And then you've got the professional government, the subject of Michael Lewis's last book, fabulous book. And that part of the government is under stress, there's no question about it. But they're still there, and NOAA is still there, and NASA is still there, and the NSF is still there, and you have to change what you say in an application for science, for funding about climate change. But the capabilities that are there, and so I think that part of the government capability has not taken as much of a hit as the more visible parts of government capability. So if you want some optimism, maybe that's it.
So I would say real quick, the other problem with the first part of the government is that they're also kind of impairing the information from the more optimistic in this regard part of the government. And that's creating issues where it's harder to actually price in some of these considerations. And they might see the light of day eventually, but they've been delayed. There was a USDA report that I think was delayed about a year before it was finally released on how climate change would impact it. So they're definitely slowing things down at the least.
Okay, well, on that cheering note, we are going to end this panel and end the conference. So I thank each of you for a really interesting discussion. Obviously, this is a topic we will be returning to for many, many years. So hope to see you again another time at our conference. I want to thank everybody at Brookings who made this online conference doable and pretty seamless. So Anna Dawson, Helen Chen, Steffi Sensula, as well as all the paper authors and panelists. And I hope hope everybody's enjoyed the conference and learned a lot. And I hope to see you all in person at Brookings next summer. Zoom is fine, but in person is better. But anyhow, thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.